The School Friend. To be taken advantage of is every woman's secret wish. Princess Elizabeth Bibesco. It would be false modesty to deny that Sally Tesler and I were the bright girls of the school. Later it was understood that I went more and more swiftly to the bed, but Sally continued being bright for some considerable time. Like many males, but few females, even among those inclined to scholarship, Sally combined a true love for the classics, the ancient ones, with an insight into mathematics which, to the small degree that I was interested, seemed to me almost magical. She won 3 scholarships, 2 gold medals, and a sojourn among the Hellenes, with all expenses paid. Before she had graduated, she had published a little book of popular mathematics which I understood made her a surprising sum of money. Later she edited several lesser Latin authors, published in editions so small that they can have brought her nothing but inner satisfaction. The foundations of all this erudition had almost certainly been laid in Sally's earliest childhood. The tale went that Dr. Tesler had once been the victim of some serious injustice, or considered that he had. Certainly it seemed to be true that, as his neighbors put it, he never went out. Sally herself once told me that she not only could remember nothing of her mother, but had never come across any trace or record of her. From the very beginning, Sally had been brought up, it was said, by her father alone. Rumor suggested that Dr. Tesler's regimen was threefold: reading, domestic drudgery, and obedience. I deduced that he used the last to enforce the 2 first. When Sally was not scrubbing the floor or washing up, she was studying Virgil and Euclid. Even then, I suspected that the doctor's ways of making his will felt would not have borne examination by the other parents. Certainly, however, when Sally first appeared at school, she had much more than a grounding in almost every subject taught, and in several which were not taught. Sally therefore was from the first a considerable irritant to the mistresses. She was always 2 years or more below the average age of her form. She had a real technique of acquiring knowledge. She respected learning in her preceptors and detected its absence. I once tried to find out in what subject Dr. Tesler had obtained his doctorate. I failed, but of course one then expected a German to be a doctor. It was the first school Sally had attended. I was a member of the form to which she was originally assigned, but in which she remained for less than a week, so eclipsing to the rest of us was her mass of information. She was 13 years and 5 months only at the time, nearly a year younger than I. I owe it to myself to say that I was promoted at the end of the term, and therefore ever after more or less kept pace with the prodigy, although this perhaps was for special reasons. Her hair was remarkably beautiful, a perfect light blonde and lustrous with brushing, although cut short and done in no particular way, indeed usually very untidy. She had dark eyes, a pale skin, a large distinguished nose, and a larger mouth. She had also a slim but precocious figure, which later put me in mind of Tessa in The Constant Nymph. For better or for worse, there was no school uniform, and Sally invariably appeared in a dark blue dress of foreign aspect and extreme simplicity, which none the less distinctly became her looks. As she grew, she seemed to wear later editions of the same dress, new and enlarged, like certain publications. Sally, in fact, was beautiful, but one would be unlikely ever to meet another so lovely who was so entirely and genuinely unaware of the fact and of its implications. And of course, her casualness about her appearance and her simple clothes added to her charm. Her disposition seemed kindly and easy-going in the extreme, and her voice was lazy to drawling. But Sally none the less seemed to live only in order to work, and although I was, I think, her closest friend, it was the urge to keep up with her which explained much of my own progress in the school. I learnt very little about her. She seemed to have no pocket money at all, as this amounted to a social deficiency of the vastest magnitude, and as my parents could afford to be and were generous, I regularly shared with her. She accepted the arrangement simply and warmly. In return, she gave me frequent little presents of books, a copy of Goethe's Faust in the original language and bound in somewhat discouraging brown leather, and an edition of Petronius with some remarkable drawings. Much later, when in need of money for a friend, I took the Faust, in no hopeful spirit, to Sotheby's. It proved to be a rebound first edition, but it was a conversation about the illustrations in the Petronius. I was able to construe Latin fairly well for a girl, but the italics and long S's daunted me, which led me to the discovery that Sally knew more than any of us about the subject illustrated. Despite her startling range of information, she seemed then, and certainly for long after, completely disinterested in any personal way. It was as if she discoursed in the gentlest, sweetest manner about some distant, far off thing, or, to use a comparison absurdly hackneyed, but here appropriate, about botany. It was an ordinary enough school, and sex was a preoccupation among us. Sally's attitude was surprisingly new and unusual. In the end, she did ask me not to tell the others what she had just told me. As if I would, I replied challengingly, but still musingly. And in fact, I didn't tell anyone until considerably later when I found that I had learned from Sally things which no one else at all seemed to know, things which I sometimes think have in themselves influenced my life, so to say, not a little. Once I tried to work out how old Sally was at the time of this conversation. I think she could hardly have been more than 15. In the end, Sally won her university scholarship and I just failed, but won the school's English essay prize and also the Good Conduct Medal, which I deemed and still deem in the nature of a stigma, but believed consolingly to be awarded more to my prosperous father than to me. Sally's conduct was in any case much better than mine, being indeed irreproachable. I had entered for the scholarship with the intention of forcing the examiners, in the unlikely event of my winning it, to bestow it upon Sally, who really needed it. When this doubtless impracticable scheme proved unnecessary, Sally and I parted company, she to her triumphs of the intellect, I to my lesser achievements. We corresponded intermittently but decreasingly as our areas of common interest diminished. Ultimately, for a very considerable time, I lost sight of her altogether, although occasionally over the years I used to see reviews of her learned books and encounter references to her in leading articles about the Classical Association and similar indispensable bodies. I took it for granted that by now we should have difficulty in communicating at all. I observed that Sally did not marry. One couldn't wonder I foolishly and unkindly drifted into supposing. When I was 41, two things happened which have a bearing on this narrative. The first was that a catastrophe befell me, which led to my again taking up residence with my parents. Details are superfluous. The second thing was the death of Dr. Tesler. I should probably have heard of Dr. Tesler's death in any case, for my parents, who, like me and the rest of the neighbors, had never set eyes upon him, had always regarded him with mild curiosity. As it was, the first I knew of it was when I saw the funeral. I was shopping on behalf of my mother and reflecting upon the vileness of things, when I observed old Mr. Orbit remove his hat in which he always served, and briefly sink his head in prayer. Between the aggregations of shredded wheat in the window, I saw the passing shape of a very old-fashioned and therefore very ornate horse-drawn hearse. It bore a coffin covered in a pall of worn purple velvet, but there seemed to be no mourners at all. "Didn't think never to see a 'earse again, Mr. Orbit," remarked old Mrs. Rind, who was ahead of me in the quay. "Pauper funeral, I expect," said her friend, old Mrs. Edge. "No such thing no more," said Mr. Orbit quite sharply and replacing his hat. "That's Dr. Tesler's funeral. Don't suppose he had no family come to look after things." I believe the three Whiteheads then got together and began to whisper, but on hearing the name I had made towards the door, I looked out. The huge ancient hearse, complete with vast black plumes, looked much too big for the narrow autumnal street. It put me in mind of how toys are often so grossly out of scale with one another. I could now see that instead of mourners, a group of urchins, shadowy in the fading light, ran behind the bier, shrieking and jeering, a most regrettable scene in a well conducted township. For the first time in months, if not years, I wondered about Sally. 3 days later, she appeared without warning at my parents' front door. It was I who opened it. "Hello, Mel." One hears of people who, after many years, take up a conversation as if the same number of hours had passed. This was a case in point. Sally, moreover, looked almost wholly unchanged. Possibly her lustrous hair was one half shade darker, but it was still short and wild. Her lovely white skin was unwrinkled. Her large mouth smiled sweetly, but as always, somewhat absently. She was dressed in the most ordinary clothes, but still managed to look like anything but a Don or a Dominie, although neither did she look like a woman of the world. It was, I reflected, hard to decide what she did look like. "Hello, Sally." I kissed her and began to condole. "Father really died before I was born. You know that." "I have heard something." I should not have been sorry to hear more, but Sally threw off her coat, sank down before the fire, and said, "I've read all your books. I loved them. I should have written." "Thank you," I said. "I wish there were more who felt like you." "You're an artist, Mel. You can't expect to be a success at the same time." She was warming her white hands. I was not sure that I was an artist, but it was nice to be told. There was a circle of leather-covered armchairs round the fire. I sat down beside her. "I've read about you often in the Times Lit," I said, "but that's all. For years, much too long." "I'm glad you're still living here," she replied. "Not still, again." "Oh?" She smiled in her gentle, absent way. "Following a session in the frying pan and another one in the fire. I'm sure you've been conducting yourself more sensibly." I was still fishing, but all she said was, "Anyway, I'm still glad you're living here." "Can't say I am. But why in particular?" "Silly Mel, because I'm going to live here too." I had never even thought of it. I could not resist a direct question. "Who told you your father was ill?" "A friend. I've come all the way from Asia Minor. I've been looking at potsherds." She was remarkably untanned for one who had been living under the sun, but her skin was of the kind which does not tan readily. "It will be lovely to have you about again. Lovely, Sally. But what will you do here?" "What do you do here?" "I write. In other ways, my life is rather over, I feel." "I write too, sometimes. At least I edit, and I don't think my life, properly speaking, has ever begun." I had spoken in self-pity, although I had not wholly meant to do so. The tone of her reply I found it impossible to define. Certainly I thought, with slight malice, certainly she does look absurdly virginal. A week later a van arrived at Dr. Tessler's house containing a great number of books, a few packed trunks, and little else, and Sally moved in. She offered no further explanation for this gesture of semi-retirement from the gay world, for we lived about 40 miles from London, too many for urban participation and too few for rural self-sufficiency. But it occurred to me that Sally's resources were doubtless not so large that she could disregard an opportunity to live rent-free, although I had no idea whether the house was freehold, and there was no mention even of a will. Sally was and always had been so vague about practicalities that I was a little worried about these matters, but she declined ideas of help. There was no doubt that if she were to offer the house for sale, she could not expect from the proceeds an income big enough to enable her to live elsewhere, and I could imagine that she shrank from the bother and uncertainty of letting. I heard about the contents of the van from Mr. Ditch, the remover, and it was in fact not until she had been in residence for about 10 days that Sally sent me an invitation. During this time, and after she had refused my help with her affairs, I had thought it best to leave her alone. Now, although the house which I must thenceforth think of as hers stood only about a quarter of a mile from the house of my parents, she sent me a postcard. It was a picture postcard of Mitylene. She asked me to tea. The way was through the avenue and round the corners of a mid-19th century housing estate for merchants and professional men. My parents' house was intended for the former, Sally's for the latter. It stood, in fact, at the very end of a cul-de-sac. Even now, the house opposite bore the plate of a dentist. I had often stared at the house during Dr. Tesler's occupancy and before I knew Sally, but not until that day did I enter it. The house looked much as it had ever done. The house was built in a gray brick so depressing that one speculated how anyone could ever come to choose it, as many once did, however, throughout the home counties. To the right of the front door, approached by 12 steps with blue and white tessellated risers, protruded a greatly disproportionate, obtuse angled bay window. It resembled the thrusting nose on a gray and wrinkled face. This bay window served the basement, the ground floor, and the first floor. Between the two latter ran a dull red string course in an acanthus pattern like a chaplet round the temples of a dowager. From the second floor window it might have been possible to step on to the top of the projecting bay, the better to view the surgery opposite, had not the second floor window been barred, doubtless as protection for a nursery. The wooden gate had fallen from its hinges and had to be lifted open and shut. It was startlingly heavy. The bell was in order. Sally was, of course, alone in the house. Immediately she opened the door, which included two large tracts of colored glass. I apprehended a change in her, essentially the first change in all the time I had known her, for the woman who had come to my parents' house a fortnight or 3 weeks before had seemed to me very much the girl who had joined my class when we were both children, but now there was a difference. In the first place, she looked different. Previously, there had always been a distinction about her appearance, however inexpensive her clothes. Now she wore a fawn jumper which needed washing and stained, creaseless gray slacks. When a woman wears trousers, they need to be smart. These were slacks, indeed. Sally's hair was not so much picturesquely untidy as in the past, but more truly in bad need of trimming. She wore distasteful sandals, and her expression had altered. "Hello, Mel. Do you mind sitting down and waiting for the kettle to boil?" She showed me into the ground floor room, although to make possible the basement it was cocked high in the air, with the bay window. "Just throw your coat on a chair." She bustled precipitately away. It occurred to me that Sally's culinary aplomb had diminished since her busy childhood of legend. The room was horrible. I had expected eccentricity, discomfort, bookworminess, even perhaps the slightly macabre, but the room was entirely commonplace and in the most unpleasing fashion. The furniture had probably been mass produced in the early 20s. It was of the kind which it is impossible by any expenditure of time and polish to keep in good order. The carpet was dingy jas. There were soulless little pictures in gilt frames. There were dreadful modern knickknacks. There was a wireless set, obviously long broken. For the time of year, the rickety, smoky fire offered none too much heat. Rejecting Sally's invitation, I drew my coat about me. There was nothing to read except a pre-war copy of Tit-Bits, which I found on the floor under the lumpy settee. Like Sally's jumper, the dense lace curtains could have done with a wash, but before long Sally appeared with tea, 6 uniform pink cakes from the nearest shop, and a flavorless liquid full of floating strangers. The crockery accorded with the other appurtenances. I asked Sally whether she had started work of any kind. "Not yet," she replied, a little dourly. "I've got to get things going in this house first." "I suppose your father left things in a mess." She looked at me sharply. "Father never went out of his library." She seemed to suppose that I knew more than I did. Looking round me, I found it hard to visualize a library. I changed the subject. "Aren't you going to find it rather a big house for one?" It seemed a harmless, though uninspired question, but Sally, instead of answering, simply sat staring before her, although it was more as if she stared within her at some unpleasant thought. "I believe in acting upon impulse." "Sally," I said, "I've got an idea. Why don't you sell this house, which is much too big for you, and come and live with me? We've plenty of room, and my father is the soul of generosity." She only shook her head. "Thank you, Mel. No." She still seemed absorbed by her own thoughts, disagreeable thoughts. "You remember what you said the other day about being glad I was living here. I'm likely to go on living here. I'd love to have you with me, Sally. Please think about it." She put down her ugly little tea plate on the ugly little table. She had taken a single small bite out of her pink cake. She stretched out her hand towards me very tentatively, not nearly touching me. She gulped slightly. "Mel?" I moved to take her hand, but she drew it back. Suddenly she shook her head violently. Then she began to talk about her work. She did not resume eating or drinking, and indeed both the cakes and the tea, which every now and then she pressed upon me in a casual way more like her former manner, were remarkably unappetizing. But she talked interestingly and familiarly for about half an hour about indifferent matters. Then she said, "Forgive me, Mel, but I must be getting on." She rose. Of course I rose too. Then I hesitated. "Sally, please think about it. I'd like it so much. Please." "Thank you, Mel. I'll think about it." "Promise?" "Promise. Thank you so much for coming to see me. I want to see much more of you." She stood in the open front door. In the dusk she looked inexplicably harassed and woebegone. "Come and see me whenever you want. Come to tea tomorrow and stay to dinner." Anything to get her out of that horrible, horrible house. But as before, she only said, "I'll think about it." Walking home, it seemed to me that she could only have invited me out of obligation. I was much hurt and much frightened by the change in her. As I reached my own gate, it struck me that the biggest change of all was that she had never once smiled. When 5 or 6 days later I had neither seen nor heard from Sally, I wrote asking her to visit me. For several days she did not reply at all. Then she sent me another picture postcard, this time of some ancient bust in a museum, informing me that she would love to come when she had a little more time. I noticed that she had made a slight error in my address, which she had hastily and imperfectly corrected. The postman, of course, knew me. I could well imagine that there was much to do in Sally's house. Indeed, it was a house of the kind in which the work is never either satisfying or complete, an ever open mouth of a house. But despite the tales of her childhood, I could not imagine the Sally I knew doing it. I could not imagine what she was doing, and I admit that I did want to know. Some time after that I came across Sally in the International Stores. It was not a shop I usually patronized, but Mr. Orbit was out of my father's particular pickles. I could not help wondering whether Sally did not remember perfectly well that it was a shop in which I was seldom found. She was there when I entered. She was wearing the same grimy slacks, and this time a white blouse, which was worse than her former jumper, being plainly filthy. Against the autumn she wore a blue raincoat, which I believed to be the same she had worn to school. She looked positively unkempt and far from well. She was nervously shoveling a little heap of dark blue bags and gaudy packets into a very ancient hold-all. Although the shop was fairly full, no one else was waiting to be served at the part of the counter where Sally stood. I walked up to her. "Good morning, Sally." She clutched the ugly hold-all to her as if I were about to snatch it. Then at once she became ostentatiously relaxed. "Don't look at me like that," she said. There was an upsetting little rasp in her voice. "After all, Mel, you're not my mother." Then she walked out of the shop. "Your change, miss!" cried the International Store shopman after her. But she was gone. The other women in the shop watched her go as if she were the town tart. Then they closed up along the section of counter where she had been standing. "Poor thing," said the shopman unexpectedly. He was young. The other women looked at him malevolently and gave their orders with conscious briskness. Then came Sally's accident. By this time there could be no doubt that something was much wrong with her, but I'd always been very nearly her only friend in the town, and her behavior to me made it difficult for me to help. It was not that I lacked will or I think courage, but that I was unable to decide how to set about the task. I was still thinking about it when Sally was run over. I imagined that her trouble, whatever it was, had affected her ordinary judgment. Apparently, she stepped right under a lorry in the high street, having just visited the post office. I learned shortly afterwards that she refused to have letters delivered at her house, but insisted upon them being left poste restante. When she had been taken to the cottage hospital, the matron, Miss Garvis, sent for me. Everyone knew that I was Sally's friend. Do you know who is her next of kin? I doubt whether she had such a thing in this country. Friends? Only me that I know of. I had always wondered about the mysterious informant of Dr. Tesler's passing. Miss Garvis considered for a moment. I'm worried about her house. Strictly speaking, in all the circumstances, I suppose I ought to tell the police and ask them to keep an eye on it, but I am sure she would prefer me to ask you. From her tone, I rather supposed that Miss Garvis knew nothing of the recent changes in Sally, or perhaps she thought it best to ignore them. As you live so close, I wonder if it would be too much to ask you just to look in every now and then. Perhaps daily might be best. I think I accepted mainly because I suspected that something in Sally's life might need, for Sally's sake, to be kept from the wrong people. Here are her keys. It was a numerous assembly for such a commonplace establishment as Sally's. I'll do as I say, Miss Garvis, but how long do you think it will be? Hard to say, but I don't think Sally's going to die. One trouble was that I felt compelled to face the assignment unaided, because I knew no one in the town who seemed likely to regard Sally's predicament with the sensitiveness and delicacy, and indeed love, which I suspected were essential. There was also a dilemma about whether or not I should explore the house. Doubtless I had no right, but to do so might, on the other hand, possibly be regarded as in Sally's higher interests. I must acknowledge, none the less, that my decision to proceed was considerably inspired by curiosity. This does not mean that I should involve others in whatever might be disclosed. Even that odious sitting room would do Sally's reputation no good. Miss Garvis had concluded by suggesting that I perhaps ought to pay my first visit at once. I went home to lunch, then I set out. Among the first things I discovered were that Sally kept every single door in the house locked, and that the remains of the tea I had taken with her weeks before still lingered in the sitting room, not mercifully the food, but the plates and cups and genteel little knives and the teapots with leaves and liquor at the bottom of it. Giving on to the passage from the front door was a room adjoining the sitting room and corresponding to it at the back of the house. Presumably, one of these rooms was intended by the builder. The house was not of a kind to have an architect, for use as a dining room, the other as a drawing room. I went through the keys. They were big keys, the doors and locks being pretentiously oversized. In the end, the door opened. I noticed a stale, cold smell. The room appeared to be in complete darkness, possibly Dr. Tesler's library. I groped round the inside of the door frame for an electric light switch, but could find nothing. I took another half step inside. The room seemed blacker than ever, and the stale, cold smell somewhat stronger. I decided to defer exploration until later. I shut the door and went upstairs. The ground floor rooms were high, which made the stairs many and steep. On the first floor were two rooms corresponding in plan to the two rooms below. It could be called neither an imaginative design nor a convenient one. I tried the front room first, again going through the rigmarole with the keys. The room was in a dilapidated condition and contained nothing but a considerable mass of papers. They appeared once to have been stacked on the bare floor, but the stacks had long since fallen over, and their component elements accumulated a deep top dressing of flaky black particles. The grime was of that ultimate kind which seems to have an actually greasy consistency. The idea of further investigating those neglected masses of scroll and manuscript made me shudder. The back room was a bedroom, presumably Sally's. All the curtains were drawn, and I had to turn on the light. It contained what must truly be termed, in the worn phrase, a few sticks of furniture, all in the same period as the pieces in the sitting room, though more exiguous and spider-looking. The inflated size and height of the room, the heavy plaster cornice and even heavier plaster rose in the center of the cracked ceiling, emphasized the sparseness of the anachronistic furnishings. There was, however, a more modern double divan bed, very low on the floor and looking as if it had been slept in but not remade for weeks. Someone seemed to have arisen rather suddenly, as at an alarm clock. I tried to pull open a drawer in the rickety dressing table. It squeaked and stuck, and proved to contain some pathetic looking underclothes of Sally's. The long curtains were very heavy and dark green. It was a depressing investigation, but I persisted. The second floor gave the appearance of having been originally one room, reached from a small landing. There was marked evidence of unskilled cuttings and bodgings, aimed, it was clear, at partitioning off this single vast room in order to form a bathroom and lavatory and a passage giving access thereto. Could the house have been originally built without these necessary amenities? Anything seemed possible. I remember the chestnut about the architect who forgot the staircase. But there was something here which I found not only squalid but vaguely frightening. The original door giving from the small landing into the one room showed every sign of having been forcibly burst open, and from the inside, characteristically, it had been hung to open outwards. The damage was seemingly not recent, although it is not easy to date such a thing. But the shattered door still hung dejectedly outward from its weighty lower hinges only, and in fact made it almost impossible to enter the room at all. Gingerly I forced it a little more forward. The ripped woodwork of the heavy door shrieked piercingly as I dragged at it. I looked in. The room, such as it had ever been, had been finally wrecked by the introduction of the batten partition which separated it from the bathroom and was covered with blistered dark brown varnish. The only contents were a few decaying toys. The nursery, as I remembered from the exterior prospect. Through the gap between the sloping door and its frame, I looked at the barred windows. Like everything else in the house, the bars seemed very heavy. I looked again at the toys. I observed that all of them seemed to be woolly animals. They were rotted with moth and mold, but not so much as to conceal the fact that at least some of them appeared also to have been mutilated. There were the decomposing leg of a teddy bear, inches away from the main torso, the severed head of a fanciful bird. It was as unpleasant a scene as every other in the house. What had Sally been doing all day? As I suspected, clearly not cleaning the house. There remained the kitchen quarters, and of course the late doctor's library. There were odd scraps of food about the basement, the signs of recent though sketchy cooking. I was almost surprised to discover that Sally had not lived on air. In general, however, the basement suggested nothing more unusual than the familiar feeling of wonder at the combined magnitude and cumbrousness of cooking operations in the homes of our middle class great grandfathers. I looked round for a candle with which to illumine the library. I even opened various drawers, bins, and cupboards. It seemed that there were no candles. In any case, I thought, shivering slightly in the descending dusk, the library was probably a job for more than a single candle. Next time I would provide myself with my father's imposing flash lamp. There seemed nothing more to be done. I had not even taken off my coat. I had discovered little which was calculated to solve the mystery. Could Sally be doping herself? It really seemed a theory. I turned off the kitchen light, ascended to the ground floor, and shutting the front door, descended again to the garden. I eyed the collapsed front gate with new suspicion. Some time later I realized that I had relocked none of the inside doors. Next morning I called at the cottage hospital. "In a way," said Miss Garvice, "she's much better, quite surprisingly so. Can I see her?" "I'm afraid not. She's unfortunately had a very restless night." Miss Garvice was sitting at her desk with a large yellow cat in her lap. As she spoke, the cat gazed up into her face with a look of complacent interrogation. Not pain? Not exactly, I think. Miss Garvis turned the cat's head downward towards her knees. She paused before saying, She's been weeping all night, and talking too, more hysterical than delirious. In the end, we had to move her out of the big ward. What does she say? It wouldn't be fair to our patients if we repeated what they say when they're not themselves. I suppose not, but still, I admit that I cannot at all understand what's the matter with her. With her mind, I mean, of course. She's suffering shock? Yes, but when I said mind, I should perhaps have said emotions. The cat jumped from Miss Garvis's lap to the floor. It began to rub itself against my stockings. Miss Garvis followed it with her eyes. Were you able to get into her house? I looked in for a few minutes. Miss Garvis wanted to question me, but she stopped herself and only asked, Everything in order? As far as I can see. I wonder if you would collect together a few things and bring them when you next come. I am sure I can leave it to you. I'll see what I can do. Remembering the house, I wondered what I could do. I rose. I'll look in tomorrow if I may. The cat followed me to the door, purring. Perhaps I shall be able to see Sally then. Miss Garvis only nodded. The truth was that I could not rest until I had investigated that back room. I was afraid, of course, but much more curious. Even my fear, I felt perhaps wrongly, was more fear of the unknown than of anything I imagined myself likely in fact to find. Had there been a sympathetic friend available, I should have been glad of his company. It was a job for a man or for no one. As it was, loyalty to Sally sent me, as before, alone. During the morning it had become more and more overcast. In the middle of lunch it began to rain. Throughout the afternoon it rained more and more heavily. My mother said I was mad to go out, but I donned a pair of heavy walking shoes and my riding mackintosh. I had borrowed my father's flash lamp before he left that morning for his business. I first entered the sitting room, where I took off my mackintosh and saturated beret. It would perhaps have been more sensible to hang the dripping objects in the lower regions, but I think I felt it was wise not to leave them too far from the front door. I stood for a time in front of the mirror, combing my matted hair. The light was fading fast, and it was difficult to see very much. The gusty wind hurled the rain against the big bay window, down which it descended like a rippling membrane of wax, distorting what little prospect remained outside. The window frame leaked copiously, making little pools on the floor. I pulled up the collar of my sweater, took the flash lamp, and entered the back room. Almost at once, in the beam of light, I found the switch. It was placed at the normal height, but about 3 feet from the doorway, as if the intention were precisely to make it impossible for the light to be switched on or off from the door. I turned it on. I had speculated extensively, but this discovery still surprised me. Within the original walls had been laid 3 courses of stonework, which continued overhead to form an arched vault under the ceiling. The gray stones had been unskilfully laid, and the vault in particular looked likely to collapse. The inside of the door was reinforced with a single sheet of iron. There remained no window at all. A crude system of electric lighting had been installed, but there seemed provision for neither heating nor ventilation. Conceivably, the room was intended for use in air raids. It had palpably been in existence for some time, but in that case it was hard to see why it should still be inhabited as it so plainly was. For within the dismal place were many rough wooden shelves laden with crumbling brown books, several battered wooden armchairs, a large desk covered with papers, and a camp bed showing, like the bed upstairs, signs of recent occupancy. Most curious of all were a small ashtray by the bedside choked with cigarette ends and an empty coffee cup. I lifted the pillow. Underneath it were Sally's pajamas, not folded but stuffed away out of sight. It was difficult to resist the unpleasant idea that she had begun by sleeping in the room upstairs, but for some reason had moved down to the stagnant cavern, which, moreover, she had stated that her father had never left. I like to think of myself as more imaginative than sensible. I had, for example, conceived it as possible that Dr. Tesler had been stark raving mad, and that the room he never left would prove to be padded, but no room could be less padded than this one. It was much more like a prison. It seemed impossible that all through her childhood Sally's father had been under some kind of duress. The room also, and horribly, resembled a tomb. Could the doctor have been one of those visionaries who are given to brooding upon the end and to decking themselves with the symbols of mortality like Donier with his shroud? It was difficult to believe in Sally emulating her father in this. For some time, I think, I fought off the most probable solution, carefully giving weight to every other suggestion which my mind could muster up. In the end, I faced the fact that, more than an oubliette or a grave, the place resembled a fortress, and the suggestion that there was something in the house against which protection was necessary was imperative. The locked doors, the scene of ruin on the second floor, Sally's behavior, I had known it all the time. I turned off the bleak light hanging by its kinked flex. As I locked the library door, I wondered upon the unknown troubles which might have followed my failure of yesterday to leave the house as I had found it. I walked the few steps down the passage from the library to the sitting room, at once preoccupied and alert. But for my peace of mind, neither preoccupied nor alert enough, because although only for a moment, a second, a gleam, when in that almost vanished light I re entered the sitting room, I saw him. As if for my benefit, to make the most of the little light, he stood right up in the big bay window. The view he presented to me was what I should call three-quarters back, but I could see a fraction of the outline of his face, entirely white, a thing which has to be seen to be believed, and with the skin drawn tight over the bones as by a tourniquet. There was a suggestion of wispy hair. I think he wore black, a garment, I thought, like a frock coat. He stood stooped and shadowy except for the glimpse of white face. Of course, I could not see his eyes. Needless to say, he was gone almost as soon as I beheld him, but it would be inexact to say that he went quite immediately. I had a scintilla of time in which to blink. I thought at first that, dead or alive, it was Dr. Tesler, but immediately afterwards I thought not. That evening I tried to take my father into my confidence. I had always considered him the kindest of men, but one from whom I had been carried far out to sea. Now I was interested, as often with people, by the unexpectedness of his response. After I had finished my story, although I did not tell him everything, to which he listened carefully, sometimes putting an intelligent question about a point I had failed to illuminate, he said, "If you want my opinion, I'll give it to you." "Please." "It's simple enough. The whole affair is no business of yours." He smiled to take the sting out of the words, but underneath he seemed unusually serious. "I'm fond of Sally. Besides, Miss Garvice asked me." "Miss Garvice asked you to look in and see if there was any post, not to poke and pry about the house." It was undoubtedly my weak point, but neither was it an altogether strong one for him. "Sally wouldn't let the postman deliver," I countered. "She was collecting her letters from the post office at the time she was run over. I can't imagine why." "Don't try," said my father. "But," I said, "what I saw, even if I had no right to go over to the house." "Mel," said my father, "you're supposed to write novels. Haven't you noticed by this time that everyone's lives are full of things you can't understand? The exceptional thing is the thing you can understand. I remember a man I knew when I was first in London. He broke off, but fortunately we don't have to understand, and for that reason you've no right to scrutinize other people's lives too closely." Completely baffled, I said nothing. My father patted me on the shoulder. "You can fancy you see things when the light's not very good, you know, particularly an artistic girl like you, Mel." Even by my parent, I still liked occasionally to be called a girl. When I went up to bed, it struck me that again something had been forgotten. This time it was Sally's few things. Naturally, It was the first matter Miss Garvice mentioned. I'm very sorry I forgot. I think it must have been the rain. I continued, excusing myself like an adolescent to authority. Miss Garvice very slightly clucked her tongue, but her mind was on something else. She went to the door of her room. Serena! Yes, Miss Garvice. See that I'm not disturbed for a few minutes, will you please? I'll call you again. Yes, Miss Garvice. Serena disappeared mousily, shutting the door. I want to tell you something in confidence. I smiled. Confidences pre-announced are seldom worthwhile. You know our routine here. We've been making various tests on Sally. One of them roused our suspicion. Miss Garvice scraped a swan vesta on the composition striker which stood on her desk. For the moment, she had forgotten the relative cigarette. Did you know that Sally was pregnant? No, I replied, but it might provide an explanation of a few things. Normally, of course, I shouldn't tell you or anyone else, but Sally is such a hysterical girl, and you say you know of no relatives. None. What can I do? I wonder if you would consider having her stay with you. Not at once, of course. When we discharge her, Sally's going to need a friend. She won't come, or she wouldn't. I've already pressed her. Miss Garvice now was puffing away like a traction engine. Why did you do that? I'm afraid that's my business. You don't know who the father is? I said nothing. It's not as if Sally were a young girl. To be perfectly frank, there are things about her condition which I don't like. It was my turn for a question. What about the accident? Hasn't that affected matters? Strangely enough, no, although it's nothing less than a miracle of one kind or the other, said Miss Garvice, trying to look broad-minded. I felt that we were unlikely to make further progress. Assuring Miss Garvice that in due course I should invite Sally once more, I asked again if I could see her. I am sorry, but it's out of the question for Sally to see anyone. I was glad that Miss Garvice did not revert to the subject of Sally's few things, although despite everything I felt guilty for having forgotten them, particularly because I had no wish to go back for them. It was out of the question even to think of explaining my real reasons to Miss Garvice, and loyalty to Sally continued to weigh heavily with me, but something must be devised. Moreover, I must not take any step which might lead to someone else being sent to Sally's house. The best I could think of was to assemble some of my own things and say they were Sally's. It would be for Sally to accept the substitution. But the question which struck me next morning was whether the contamination in Sally's house could be brought to an end by steps taken in the house itself, or whether it could be influenced from the outside. Sally's mysterious restlessness, as reported by Miss Garvice, was far from reassuring, but on the whole I inclined to see it as an aftermath or revulsion. Sally's pregnancy I refused at this point to consider at all. It was impossible to doubt that immediate action of some kind was vital. Exorcism or conceivably arson, I doubt whether I am one to whom the former would ever strongly appeal, certainly not as a means of routing something so apparently sensible to feeling as to sight. The latter, on the other hand, might well be defeated, apart from other difficulties, by the stone strong box of a library. Flight, I considered it long and seriously, but still it seemed that my stronger motive in the whole affair was pity for Sally, so I stayed. I did not visit the hospital that morning from complete perplexity as to what there to do or say, but instead during the afternoon wandered back to the house. Despite my horror of the place, I thought that I might hit upon something able to suggest a course of action. I would look more closely at those grimy papers and even at the books in the library. The idea of burning the place down was still by no means out of my mind. I would further ponder the inflammability of the house and the degree of risk to the neighbors. All the time, of course, I was completely miscalculating my own strength and what was happening to me. But as I hoisted the falling gate, my nerve suddenly left me. Again, something which had never happened to me before, either in the course of these events or at any previous time. I felt very sick. I was much afraid lest I faint. My body felt simultaneously tense and insubstantial. Then I became aware that Mr. Orbit's delivery boy was staring at me from the gate of the dentist's house opposite. I must have presented a queer spectacle because the boy seemed to be standing petrified. His mouth, I saw, was wide open. I knew the boy quite well. It was essential for all kinds of reasons that I conduct myself suitably. The boy stood, in fact, for public opinion. I took a couple of deep breaths, produced the weighty bunch of keys from my handbag, and ascended the steps as steadily as possible. Inside the house, I made straight for the basement with a view to a glass of water. With Mr. Orbit's boy no longer gaping at me, I felt worse than ever, so that even before I could look for a tumbler or reach the tap, I had to sink upon one of the two battered kitchen chairs. All my hair was damp, and my clothes felt unbearably heavy. Then I became aware that steps were descending the basement staircase. I completed my sequence of new experiences by fainting indeed. I came round to the noise of an animal, a snuffling, grunting cry, which seemed to come from with much persistence from the floor above. I seemed to listen to it for some time, even trying, though failing, to identify what animal it was, before recovering more fully and realizing that Sally was leaning back against the dresser and staring at me. Sally, is that you? Who'd you think it was? It's my house. She no longer wore the stained gray slacks, but was dressed in a very curious way about which I do not think it fair to say more. In other ways also the change in her had become complete. Her eyes had a repulsive lifelessness. The bone structure of her face, previously so fine, had altered unbelievably. There was an unpleasant croak in her voice, precisely as if her larynx had lost flexibility. Will you please return my keys? I even had difficulty in understanding what she said, although doubtless my shaky condition did not help. Very foolishly, I rose to my feet while Sally glared at me with her changed eyes. I had been lying on the stone floor. There was a bad pain in the back of my head and neck. Glad to see you're better, Sally. I didn't expect you'd be about for some time yet. My words were incredibly foolish. She said nothing, but only stretched out her hand. It, too, was changed. It had become gray and bony with protruding, knotted veins. I handed her the big bunch of keys. I wondered how she had entered the house without them. The animal wailing above continued without intermission. To it now seemed to be added a noise which struck me as resembling that of a pig scrambling. Involuntarily, I glanced upwards to the ceiling. Sally snatched the keys, snatched them gently and softly, not violently, then cast her unblinking eyes upward in parody of mine, and emitted an almost deafening shriek of laughter. Do you love children, Mel? Would you like to see my baby? Truly it was the last straw, and I do not know quite how I behaved. Now Sally seemed filled with terrible pride. Let me tell you, Mel, she said, that it's possible for a child to be born in a manner you'd never dream of. I had begun to shudder again, but Sally clutched hold of me with her gray hand and began to drag me up the basement stairs. Will you be godmother? Come and see your godchild, Mel. The noise was coming from the library. I clung to the top of the basement baluster. Distraught as I was, I now realized that the scrambling sound was connected with the tearing to pieces of Dr. Tesler's books. But it was the wheezy, throaty cry of the creature which most turned my heart and sinews to water or to steel, because as Sally tugged at me, trying to pull me away from the baluster and into the library, I suddenly realized that she had no strength at all. Whatever else had happened to her, she was weak as a wraith. I dragged myself free from her, let go of the baluster, and made toward the front door. Sally began to scratch my face and neck, but I made a quite capable job of defending myself. Sally then began to call out in her unnatural voice. She was trying to summon the creature into the passage. She scraped and tore at me while panting out a stream of dreadful endearments to the thing in the library. In the end, I found that my hands were about her throat, which was bare despite the cold weather. I could stand no more of this wrecked voice. Immediately she began to kick, and the shoes she was wearing seemed to have metal toes. I had the final awful fancy that she had acquired iron feet. Then I threw her from me on the floor of the passage and fled from the house. It was now dark, somehow darker outside the house than inside it, and I found that I still had strength enough to run all the way home. I went away for a fortnight, although on general grounds it was the last thing I had wanted to do. At the end of that time, and with Christmas drawing near, I returned to my parents' house. I was not going to permit Sally to upset my plan for a present way of life. At intervals through the winter I peered at Sally's house from the corner of the cul-de-sac in which it stood, but never saw a sign of occupancy or change. I had learned from Miss Garvice that Sally had simply disappeared from the cottage hospital. Disappeared? Long before she was due to discharge, I need hardly say. How did it happen? The night nurse was going her rounds and noticed the bed was empty. Miss Garvice was regarding me as if I were a material witness. Had we been in Miss Garvice's room at the hospital, Serena would have been asked to see that we were not disturbed. Sally had not been back long enough to be much noticed in the town, and I observed that soon no one mentioned her at all. Then one day, between Easter and Whitsun, I found she was at the front door. "Hello, Mel." Again she was taking up the conversation. She was, as until last autumn she had always been, with that strange, imperishable, untended prettiness of her, and her sweet, absent smile. She wore a white dress. Sally, what could one say? Our eyes met. She saw that she would have to come straight to the point. "I've sold my house." I kept my head. "I said it was too big for you. Come in." She entered. "I've bought a villa in the Cyclades." "For your work?" She nodded. "The house fetched a price, of course, and my father left me more than I expected." I said something banal. Already she was lying on the big sofa and looking at me over the arm. "Mel, I should like you to come and stay with me for a long time, as long as you can. You're a free agent, and you can't want to stay here." Psychologists, I recollected, have ascertained that the comparative inferiority of women in contexts described as purely intellectual is attributable to the greater discouragement and repression of their curiosity when children. "Thank you, Sally, but I'm quite happy here, you know." "You're not, are you, Mel?" "No, I'm not." "Well, then, one day I shall probably go." And that is the end of The School Friends by Robert Aickman.